Powered by Riverside FM.
This is a podcast about when to ask a question. This week, the UK's Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, has resigned from government. She resigned after having been found in breach of the ministerial code. There had been significant speculation, debate about her situation in relation to paying tax on a property transaction for several weeks. This week, in short order, she referred herself to the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards and received his conclusion. He found her in breach of the code and articulated his reasons in a 3-page letter which has been made publicly available. I have read that letter, and in many ways it tells you all you need to know about the situation. It describes her tax situation as being complicated, that she had received some legal advice but not tax advice, that described one rate of tax that she must pay. However, it had been clear it was not specialist tax advice and suggested this was sought. She did not seek further advice, and it is this failure to do so that the advisor has taken issue with. Put simply, the ministerial code requires that ministers uphold the highest possible standards within public life. By not seeking such advice, she had not met such standards. Therefore, it was a breach of the code. Everything else, whether that's the complicated nature of the tax situation, mitigations, were not found to be relevant to that one decision. And in effect, this view of a breach led directly to her resignation. In fact, that situation is quite straightforward. People's views will inevitably be coloured by their political persuasions, and not just by their political persuasions, but also by their views on HMRC and whether it's appropriate that a breach of the code inevitably leads to a resignation or a sacking. But none of that is the topic of this podcast. But the point I'm highlighting is that the whole situation boils down to a finding that she should have asked for something. And that simple summary brings to my mind another situation about which I am still personally exercised and feel somewhat aggrieved. It's a completely different context, but it also hinges on the question of whether or not a question or inquiries should have happened. The situation is a judgment, that's judgment with a capital J, of the Competition Appeals Tribunal, a specialist and niche body. In its decision, in the case of JD Sports, a sportswear retailer, versus the Competition and Markets Authority, known as the CMA. The CMA reviewed an attempted acquisition by JD Sports of the rival retail chain Foot Asylum and sought to block it. JD Sports had appealed this decision, and it won. The ground on which it won was essentially on the basis that the CMA did not ask a question that it should have done. I know that both I and at least one other person feel that if you read the judgment and think about the logical conclusion of what the tribunal says, you'll find that it's nonsensical. Probably everybody else has moved on, and ultimately the decision didn't matter because the appeal of the merger just led it to being remitted back to the CMA, and the same conclusion was found. The merger was ultimately blocked. But I'll give you an overview of why I found this a contentious decision. The key feature of the case was that it was reaching its conclusion right at the period that the impacts of the COVID pandemic were occurring. Key decision phase was taking place in March 2020, and the final report was published right at the start of May 2020. The appeal turned on what inquiries the CMA should have made in relation to the impact of COVID on these retailers. Should it have asked them more questions about the impact? In essence, JD Sports' appeal alleged that the CMA failed to make reasonable inquiries in relation to the impact of COVID-19, and that in not doing so, it acted irrationally, thus meeting the standard of a judicial review. The CMA had made inquiries and sought evidence at the beginning of March 2020, just as the impact of COVID was starting to take hold in East Asia and in certain parts of Europe. The information that returned from JD Sports and others at that stage was of a very generalized and speculative nature, which did not permit the CMA to make robust findings as to the enduring impact of the pandemic. What it did discover from that information was that the retailers felt that their previous forecasts for 2020 and 2021 were obsolete. The CMA considered whether to ask other questions, but reached the view that any further evidence that it obtained on the medium to long impact of COVID on the retailers would be speculative and insufficiently robust for reliable conclusions to be drawn. Accordingly, from mid-March 2020 onwards, it did not ask further questions. That left a period of approximately 6 weeks, the end of March and most of April 2020, in which the case was still live, but no further inquiries were made. It is worth stating the obvious point that there were also a number of practical considerations at this point. The CMA, and indeed everyone else, was coping with an unprecedented pandemic situation and the subsequent lockdowns. Nevertheless, the reason motivating the CMA's decision not to obtain further evidence was that it doubted that robust evidence capable of shedding light on the nature and extent of the medium to long impact would be available. It therefore proceeded to conclude its investigation as if such information was unavailable. It determined that it would not have been possible for the suppliers to provide information on potentially enduring changes. And this is the nub of it. The tribunal disagreed. It felt that the CMA did not put itself in a position by not seeking such information. The most damning quote from the tribunal's judgment was it said that the CMA had closed its mind to the utility of requesting further information. And on this basis, it found that the CMA had acted irrationally. The party's appeal was upheld and the inquiry was remitted back to the CMA. I cannot get past this quote. I think the logical conclusion of what the tribunal is saying is that the CMA must ask questions because it can't dismiss their usefulness until it knows what it receives. This must be wrong. Surely it would imply CMA must ask questions about everything. In this specific circumstance, I think it was reasonable for the CMA to conclude that there was so much uncertainty, and the uncertainty equally affected its own judgment as much as those of the retailers, that there was no value in further information. Nevertheless, this is a specific finding in a niche judgment that I suspect will be lost to time. Even if it was to be surfaced, lawyers, as they always do, would point out the specificness of each situation and each case's own facts, for which I would be grateful, but I remain of the opinion that in some cases it's best not to ask.